All right, good afternoon and welcome everybody. I am Mike Sexton, Fellow and Director of MEI's Cyber Program, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Big Brother, Internet Age Surveillance and Censorship in the Middle East. Today we'll hear from an outstanding panel of experts from diverse sectors who will discuss surveillance in the Middle East. What purposes do they intend to serve, and are they effective? What are the excesses and human implications of these practices? Can censorship and surveillance play a responsible role in containing disinformation and thwarting disease, or are they doomed to be abused by the powers that be? We are pleased to have with us today Mark Owen Jones. Jones is currently an assistant professor in Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. At the moment, he is working on a number of topics, including propaganda and Twitter bots, mapping sectarian hate speech, and archival work related to Bahrain and land appropriation. Second, I would like to welcome Sahar Khamis. Sahar Khamis is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. She's an expert on Arab and Muslim media and the former head of the Mass Communication Information Science Department in Qatar University. Next, we have Raed Labasi. Labasi is Amnesty Tech's North Africa technologist and researcher, and researcher at Amnesty International. Based in Tunis, Raed conducts research and investigations on targeted surveillance of human rights defenders in North Africa. He worked previously as an information security consultant, holds an engineering diploma from Telecom Paris. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome Mohammed Suleiman. Suleiman is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute Cyber Program. He works on the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business in the Middle East and North Africa, and his extensive cross-sectoral network throughout the region informs his analysis. Although this is a virtual meeting, I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature that you should all see at the bottom of your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter with hashtag MEI events or email events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please use Zoom's chat function or email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I will be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. With that, let's get started. I'm going to first just give each panelist 5 or so minutes to talk a bit about their background and how exactly they work in the areas of digital surveillance and censorship. Let's start with Raed.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to speak with all the panelists today. So I'm Raed Labesi. I work with Amnesty International, and I work with Amnesty Tech, which is a program in Amnesty International aimed at countering the violations of human rights using technology through research, investigation, and then also through strategic litigation. So mainly in Amnesty Tech, we have 2 big teams. The first team is works on the use of artificial intelligence and big data and how the effects of the use of artificial intelligence and big data have on human rights and human rights violations. And then there is the second team, my team, which is disrupting surveillance team. And we work mainly on investigating and exposing tactics and actors and technologies that drive unlawful government surveillance and mainly cases of abuses of these, the use of this surveillance technology. Also, we work on alerting human rights defenders about the evolving surveillance tactics that some authorities and governments employ against them, and also to provide support to the human rights activists and human rights defenders in their activities while using technology. Also, the other things that we do, we engage in strategic communication to delegitimize the surveillance industry and raise awareness about its harms. Also, we do strategic litigation. For example, the latest litigation that we did was maybe you heard of it, the case injustice of Amnesty International against the Israeli company NSO Group after the hacking of one of Amnesty's staff member using that technology. And also we support the global moratorium for that from David Kay's, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression on the sale of surveillance tech. Like, so we support this call through campaigning and advocacy, and also we try to advocate for tech vendors to exercise greater responsibility for at-risk users, and especially human rights defenders, who, for them, like the threat model is completely different than the normal users. But we'll get into that, I think, through this discussion. So mainly this is what we work on, but my day-to-day work is to investigate these violations through the analysis of devices, for example. So we meet human rights defenders, we analyze their devices, looking for evidence of targeting, of targeted surveillance on them. And as we see lately, the threat concerns more mobile devices than the classic surveillance issues on normal computer devices and other stuff. So yeah, we'll get into this, I hope, more during this discussion.
Thanks so much, Raed. Mohammed, do you want to speak for a few minutes? You're on mute, Mohammed. Adjusting to the new world.
My bad. I have been trying to deal with that. It's bad. Thank you for having me. It's Mohammed Sulaiman. I come from a very technical background. I studied engineering in Cairo. I worked in tech policy in Cairo for 4 or 5 years before I come here to study policy. And right now I'm working as a consultant. I help big tech companies with digital policy in the Middle East across different sectors. And I'm an unresident scholar with the Middle East Institute. As Mike mentioned earlier, I focus on the intersection between tech, geopolitics, and business. I have been working on a chapter for the incoming MEI book titled Cyber Beast, Cyber War in the Middle East. This is basically who I am in less than 50 seconds. You want me to give my own remarks on the subject, or should I just wait until people introduce themselves?
You can go ahead.
So briefly about the subject and giving my remarks, I will start with how I see the global landscape, and then I will tell you my answers on how this is impacting the Middle East and my own prediction for the future. I think today, almost April 1st, we are in a point that the COVID-19 outbreak is at unprecedented levels, and this is pressuring most of the governments right now. I can summarize this in one sentence: your data, your life. This is the dichotomy that we have. That the Chinese model that succeeded in dealing with COVID-19 in Wuhan through big data and mass surveillance have been making a lot of countries rethinking about their own concerns, old concerns when it comes to mass surveillance and data collection. Today, EU, Israel, the US have been trying basically to get access to mobile phone locations to identify people at risk of infection, or at least trying to get hands-on. In the Middle East, this is a region that has been going through a massive social disruption since 2011. Governments have been stepping up their own digital capabilities, basically to avoid any kind of upcoming disruptions or demonstrations like what we have seen recently in Algeria and Sudan. And I think having the international community accepting the fact that mass data collection is essential to fight COVID-19 will legitimize some of the efforts being done by authoritarian governments in the region to step up their own capabilities. And I think it's really hard to imagine if the governments obtain these capabilities that they will let go on that after containing COVID-19. I think we should give like a deeper dive during the conversation, more details. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. Mark, do you want to say a few words? You're still on mute, Mark.
I got it. I realized there was no yellow box around my face. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. My name's Mark. I'm an assistant professor, as Michael mentioned. I've been working on issues of surveillance mostly since 2011. My main focus at that point was looking at social media, and crucially looking at a time when everyone was acknowledging the kind of emancipatory potential of technology and social media, especially with regards to the Arab uprisings. I was focusing more on the dystopian potentials, because my case study in particular was Bahrain. So I was looking at how the regime and those loyal to the regime were using social media to essentially monitor the opposition forces, and the different ways in which they were doing this. So, you know, this ranges from obviously crude kind of intimidation tactics or appropriating people's information from social media or Facebook, and then reposting it with information about those people, to slightly more sophisticated forms of IP spying and that kind of thing. So my main focus, or getting into this, was essentially looking at social media, these new technologies, and how they were actually leveraged to enforce political repression on the opposition movement in Bahrain. And obviously, as my PhD developed, I became more interested in the region generally, interested in both technologies. I became very fascinated by the history of surveillance in the region, notably from British imperialism in the Gulf in particular, and the kind of methods that the British introduced. I then became interested in how the history of surveillance informed current practice. And then more to the point, I became very interested in the surveillance industrial complex, how the modern relationships between companies and states form assemblages in which essentially it's not always accurate to look at surveillance as a method of control that originates from the state in particular, but surveillance as a behavioral mechanism that has commercial interests, state interests, forms these networks of global influence that seek to monetize both people's data, but also political repression. So I became very interested in the global and to an extent the geopolitics, but the global nature of the breakdown of the state and the role surveillance plays in that. More recently, I've been looking at disinformation and also the use of data, and how, for example, the use of data extraction in the Middle East works. I think theories of data colonialism and surveillance capitalism are very interesting. There was a paper written on data colonialism, which I think is a very important concept for what we will discuss. And roughly speaking, this is the fact that increasingly our data is being extracted from us with limited consent from us, and unless you think clicking I agree to terms and conditions counts as consent, and that data is then being monetized and marketized, often in ways that we don't have full control over. And this is happening at such a frightening pace that it's becoming very hard to stop it. And I think, as Mohammed mentioned, crises facilitate the speed at which this happens. So we've had the Arab uprisings more recently, we've had COVID-19 happening now, which is of course creating some sort of legitimization of this data extraction, because obviously we're being told that it's in our best interest, and to an extent this is true. So we have to be very mindful now globally, but especially in the Middle East, about how crises are exploited to weaken our preparedness to defend against privacy intrusions and surveillance. So that's what I'm currently working on now, mostly focusing on the GCC.
All right, thank you so much. That was very insightful. Sahar, would you like to speak for a minute?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to join this important and timely panel. Thank you to Middle East Institute. Thank you to Michael and his team. As Michael mentioned, my name is Sahar Khamis. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm also an affiliate professor of Women's Studies and an affiliate professor in the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland. Really, before the Arab Spring, I was pretty much focusing on gender issues, and especially issues related to health awareness, family planning, and literacy in the Arab world, in particular as related to Arab women and to Muslim women and Egyptian women, being an Egyptian American woman myself. And I wrote a book, co-authored a book called Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, that was published in 2009 with Muhammad Nawawi, that talked about cyberspace from the religious perspective. How can we understand the interactions and dynamics of the discourses between Muslims and other Muslims and non-Muslims in cyberspace? And of course, we all understand that religion is not separate from the social realities and the political realities. So there was this religio-political element to the book, but politics was not number one focus until, of course, the big event happened. We all know what the big event was, right? The eruption of the Arab Spring, in 2011. And with that moment, I felt like this is very, very important. We cannot ignore this historic moment. So my second co-authored book with Mohammed Nawawi was called Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism. And we were still at this moment that I can call techno-euphoria, when we were talking about how the young activists and protesters were really using this moment in order to raise awareness about issues of corruption, violations of human rights, government, mispractices and negative practices and all of that stuff. And that was pretty much the focus of a lot of my research. A lot of my writing and research afterwards dealt with the issue of cyber activism and how it played an important role in paving the way for social and political transformation in the Arab world. I never dropped my interest in social issues and gender issues. So I still had a lot of research also published on women in particular and cyber feminism and digital feminism, which means how women are using social media also to advocate not just social issues, but social and political issues at the same time. So my last book, the third one, is Arab Women's Activism, Sociopolitical Transformation, and Unfinished Gendered Revolutions, co-edited with Amal Mili. And that was pretty much a panoramic view of different writers and authors from within and from inside and outside the Arab world who are looking at issues of cyber activism and how it has been used by different women in different parts of the Arab world. Most recently, my work is focusing on digital authoritarianism and how governments, for example, in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, are using social media now as tools to actually kind of control the narrative. And I totally agree with other panelists that at this very important moment with the coronavirus pandemic outbreak, we have a very important moment as academics and researchers to talk about a new level of government domination and authoritarianism in cyberspace. And we're going to see how this plays out in terms of who controls the narrative, who frames the narrative, how and why.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to remind all of our guests, if you are joining us via Zoom, there is a Q&A function if you hover over the app where you can ask questions. I just saw one come in. So please feel free to come in with your questions, or you can tweet them at #MEIEvents. So first question I want to ask for Sahar is, you describe civilian use and government civilian use of the internet and government surveillance and censorship on the internet as a tug of war. I wanted to know if you can chart from a really bird's eye view the state of that tug of war in the from the Arab Spring to today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a very important and good question, really, because in 2011, everybody was caught in this moment of quote unquote techno-euphoria, and myself included. I consider myself one of the people guilty of this phenomena. When I look back at my writings and research right now, I see like there was all of this, hailing of social media as these strong tools that have a great potential for democratization and reform and paving the way for socio-political transformation and change. And indeed, that there was a reason for that. There was this big gap between the learning curve of the activists and the protesters on one hand, and the regimes and the governments on the other hand. Many of the regimes and governments were taken by surprise. They were unprepared. They were not ready for this wave that was coming at them, and they were pretty much at a disadvantage. They were trying to play catch up, with the protesters and the young activists, but many times they even used wrong techniques, sometimes even backfiring techniques that caused more damage than good and really backfired. For example, you have the pulling down the kill switch. In the case of Egypt, when they completely created this internet shutdown and blackout for a whole week and cutting down the cell phone service, what happened was they really contributed to fueling more protests, and people flooded the streets even in larger numbers, trying to find out what's happening there in the street. And it really created a backfiring, counterproductive effect. So there was this big gap, but that did not last for very long. Just like protesters and activists have an eye and ears and mind, and they can really learn, so are the regimes as well. Regimes are observing and watching and monitoring, and they're building their own learning curves. So we saw after that, for example, the Syrian regime looked at what happened in Egypt and Tunisia and started to build the learning curve. They created Syrian Electronic Army, which is an army basically of quote unquote hackers who go after the regime's opponents and try to hack them and trace their IP addresses and shut down their websites and sabotage them. and so on. And oftentimes they were hailed by, President Assad, like they're very heroic and patriotic, like they're an army of hackers, for God's sake. But this is really what's happening here. Now, fast forward 9 years and we are in 2020, you're looking and seeing how these regimes are using new levels of digital authoritarianism, using really new tools and new means in this digital cyberspace to try to really have more of an advantage, even compared to their own opponents and compared to the protesters and activists. We're seeing this, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, using the electronic army and going after its own, opponents in the diaspora and really trying to find out where they are. And, sometimes there are horrific consequences for these young people and for their families as well. And we are seeing this story. We're seeing how, governments are now controlling the narrative on the coronavirus, crisis, and making sure only the official story gets out and trying to punish those who have any kind of contradictory story or narrative that is different from the official narrative. So we're seeing now a different level whereby governments are really building their own learning curves, sometimes in very dangerous and very detrimental ways.
Okay, we've got some good attendee questions that have come in, but I do want to just first off see if any of our other panelists would like to follow up on that question or Sahar's answer. No? Mark?
No, I mean, I'm happy to, if we've got other questions, happy to let them come in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's one that I think would be good for Mohammed or for Sahar to answer. What do you see as the long-term negative implications of government manipulation of the internet, media, and social media? For example, we are already seeing a decline in Egypt's film industry, which is damaging Egypt's regional soft power. I'll start with Mohammed.
Sure. I think it's basically similar to any other region. I would say the excessive use of disinformation warfare, specifically targeting local population, will make people and citizens very skeptical of whatever information being presented. And I think this is so apparent today when you see people responses in the local level to the COVID-19 coverage from the states, that people have a big problem around the region to really accept the numbers, that people are disputing the numbers being presented by the officials, health officials, that people are, and we have seen even that people started to even create their own realities about COVID-19. All these WhatsApp messages that we see coming from our own grandfathers, mothers, WhatsApps, it's a basic indication that people have no trust in the official channels when it comes to information. So this is how I see the long-term damage, that you have a huge loss of trust in the official communication and trust in the government, even during time of crisis.
Mm-hmm. I think that I totally agree with Mohammed that there's definitely this issue of the credibility crisis. When I teach Arab media to my students at the University of Maryland, I say some of the big problems that Arab media and Arab journalists face is this difficulty in getting accurate, correct, verified information. Oftentimes we have what is called the knowledge crisis, the difficulty of obtaining credible information which is really real rather than fabricated or manipulated by the regime in power. And if you keep manipulating the narrative and if you keep tightly controlling it and sometimes trying to block the truth from coming out, what happens is your credibility suffers a big deal, and that will have its own economic and social and political consequences. Just like the person who asked the question mentioned about Egypt's soft power or the media industry or the film industry. The same could be said about tourism, about economy, about all different other aspects. And I totally agree with Mohammed that especially in the case of crisis, that's when people resort the most to fill the gaps using rumors. That's the time when lies, misinformation, rumors can spread the most if you don't have a constant, credible, trustworthy, constant flow of information from credible sources. So you cannot just punish journalists for doing their job, withdrawing their credentials or stopping them or expelling them. These are all very negative and very harmful practices, and they definitely have negative consequences.
Thank you so much for that. I do want to ask a quick question for Raed, given your work specifically on with respect to NSO Group. So for attendees who are not familiar, NSO Group is an Israeli spyware firm that produces spyware that that they sell to various governments to be able to hack into cell phones that is supposed to be used for very serious crime, terrorism, stuff like human trafficking. But it's been found many times on the phones of journalists and activists. So Amnesty International is currently engaged in litigation against NSO Group to try to, if I've got that correct, to restrict its licensing privileges. So Rod, I wanted to specifically ask, because it's been revealed that NSO is trying to work with the Israeli Ministry of Defense to develop a kind of analytical platform, something like similar to what Palantir does, in order to be able to track the spread of the novel coronavirus. Do you see this as a sort of natural, just transition into a similar kind of cyber tracking field for NSO, or what role do you think that this is meant to play in in improving NSO Group's image in Israel and worldwide?
Yeah, actually, this coronavirus crisis is a good test for all the surveillance industry, and it's a good occasion for them to step up their game and to present new products and also to appear as not evildoers as many of the activists and human rights organizations said in the past and uncovered also in the past, like all the abuses that many governments do using their technologies. But for now, for example, like speaking about NSO and the role of NSO in the crisis, it's not only NSO, and we don't know exactly with whom. For now, I don't have like the exact information with whom the Israeli government is working on this tracking technology. Many say this is NSO, but there is also in Israel, like there are many surveillance companies that could do this. But from what we have from our point of view, we work more on targeted surveillance, but we see like this new trend of developing like mass surveillance products from the surveillance industry, which and tracking technologies. But this is not actually this is not something that is new. There was this dichotomy in the world between the monetization of data and the surveillance capitalism example and the Chinese example, which is like in contradiction to this one, is more about like tracking and getting control over what's in the network. So there is this dichotomy, but today like we see that there is a big whitewashing of all this surveillance industry, unfortunately, and we dive head first in this new model of surveillance and this new model of internet, saying that yeah, the surveillance industry can bring us solution to this problem, but at the same time we don't know if it will actually bring solution or not, because all we have today are like only like minor experience in some countries where this led to some results, and we don't know to which extent like the results that were met were due to the use of this technology or to other techniques that are like mainly basically only normal confinement or other stuff. But the problem is we don't also we cannot we don't know if the benefits of the use of this technology in this context outweigh the abuses of this technology and outweigh the new world that we are, the new internet or the new use of internet that we will have after this crisis. So is it worth it to pay like all our privacy for the results that we are hoping for, and we don't know for now what results we are expecting?
Thank you so much for that. I've got a question here for Mark. Have you seen any troll activity, whether from Saudi Arabia or other countries, that is related to the coronavirus? And if so, what messages do you see them spreading? And does it tie to previous messages through similar methods?
Yes, I mean, I do. I think, firstly, I mean, I want to highlight, obviously, trolls usually are those suspicious online accounts that usually engage in aggressive or intimidating behavior or spread disinformation for various reasons. I mean, whilst that's relevant to cybersecurity, it's also, I think, relevant to surveillance, because we have to remember with surveillance, one aspect of it, or a certain aspect of it, is to create the perception that people are being monitored constantly. And you can do that by creating, if you create fake accounts or you create the fake perception that there are people there with specific beliefs, then you are by definition creating an entity or a false entity that might discourage people from engaging in certain behaviors, especially if they believe that those accounts, for example, work for an electronic army or on behalf of some government or agency. So I just wanted to tie that conceptually with surveillance, even though I would still say that there are slightly different conceptual areas. But to answer the question, yes. There is. I mean, we've seen a lot of disinformation about coronavirus, but there's definitely certain levels of it. I mean, there's the conspiracy that links it to George Soros, Bill Gates, and other such people that was being spread by a candidate for Republican candidate for Congress in Los Angeles, and that got a lot of retweets. In the Gulf, we've seen a number. Again, most of them seem to be targeting Qatar and Iran and Turkey. This seems to be very much tying into the discourse we've seen since 2017 and the blockade of Qatar. So what I've seen since January, is saying that some of the conspiracies I've seen, one came from a Saudi journalist whose tweet has now been deleted, but she claimed that Qatar had been funding the research of this virus that was then spread. Another Saudi commentator, for example, and Saudi accounts on Twitter were saying that Turkey were being negligent about the monitoring of coronavirus in order to infect Arabs who would then return to the Arabian Peninsula in order to spread the virus. So that was another example of one of the discourses we've seen. And similarly, we've heard generally that Qatar has been irresponsible. There's been a recent spat between Bahrain and Qatar with regards to how to deal with coronavirus, which I think is interesting. There's an interesting aspect of this which I think also highlights an important aspect that we need to look at with surveillance, especially with regards to corona, and that's the racialized element of it. One important thing, if we're going to sort of approach this from critical surveillance studies, is how are these new measures going to disproportionately affect certain groups based on their ethnic, racial, language, linguistic, or religious characteristics. Already in the Gulf, in particular, we've seen a certain hostility to those who are Shia, denigration of their religious practices, being seen as, playing a key part in spreading corona. The recent spat between Qatar and Bahrain, people have accused the Bahraini government of disregarding this group of Bahrainis who are coming back from Iran simply because they're likely to be Shia. So we have to think as well how in the future, and I mean, generally with COVID, we've seen how there's been a lot of increase in hostility towards those of Asian descent. So I think going forward, when we have these things like pandemics or generally, we need to look and explore how surveillance is targeted at certain communities based on certain characteristics. And that's something that I think is increasingly important. And we're probably going to see more bespoke forms of surveillance, especially if we have data points on ourselves that are integrated more holistically. And I think this does tie in with surveillance capitalism, because the problem is with surveillance capitalism, the more information that we potentially contribute about ourselves that marks characteristics such as our race, gender, whatever, the more there might be crosstalk between that information and those in, say, the security industry, who then create products that allow for discriminatory practices of surveillance that create tiers of higher surveillance structures. Let's remember that no community generally in history in all forms of surveillance are surveyed to the same extent. Surveillance is by definition a stratified process, right? So usually if we're looking in the Middle East, different communities within the Middle East will have different forms of surveillance enacted upon them, whether it's workers who live in camps outside certain areas, they're kept away from other areas. That's a form of quadrillage, which is what Foucault is how that they separated plague outbreaks in cities back in the day. They kept people separate from one another in order to avoid the spread of plague. So, how might those structures then be reflected in digital practices? I think this is something we've got to look more towards as well.
Thank you so much. It's an excellent answer. I've got a couple of questions here that are about sort of personal privacy, asking about whether NGOs, groups like Amnesty, use VPNs or other platforms. What sorts of security tools do they use? Whether it makes sense to create a separate social media page to express someone's political beliefs. I personally know of at least a few people in the Gulf who have anonymous public Twitter profiles where they'll express their thoughts, but unless you were to actually find out whose email address was using it, you would never be able to tell who, or doing some social network analysis to see who they follow, you wouldn't be able to find out who is actually running the Twitter profile. I was wondering if you all have some thoughts on, in terms of personally protecting yourself and your work, being able to express yourself politically without putting yourself in danger. I think I'll start with Ryan on that.
Okay, so speaking about protection, actually the question is, there are people who can afford expensive devices and expensive security services, and people who cannot. And this is like the real question today, I think, like how to get everyone at the same level of profiting from security measures and security features of devices. For example, not everyone can afford the most secure phone today, which is arguable. Like the iPhone today is dubbed as the most secure phone, but not anyone can afford an iPhone, and especially like human rights activists who really need a secure device to be able to do their job in a context that's very, very difficult for them. So in my opinion, like, and today it's the fight is to push more security features. That's what we are trying to push for as Amnesty. As Amnesty Tech, we try to push for more security features to be adopted by the big tech companies. That's what we advocate for, so that we can, especially, we come from the angle of the human rights activists who are every day targeted by governments and by hostile governments, and who, for example, journalists who need to protect their sources, for whom their phone is really crucial to their work. So if they are targeted with, and nowadays we know how like governments have these kind of capabilities of even without clicking or anything, infecting your phone and getting all access on the phone. So imagine if you're a journalist in an authoritarian country working, doing investigation, and generally you don't have like access to the most secure and the latest secure phone. So what we try to do is to push for these changes to come from phone manufacturers, from big platforms developers, to integrate like these features for the most at-risk community, which are the human rights activists and working in very and by highlighting these profiles and by doing advocacy and campaigning on certain cases, we try to attract attention and make people like make this step, make the companies make this step of securing more and providing more secure features. So for example, like answering the VPN question, like sometimes trainings, for example, we did many security trainings with Amnesty Tech, but trainings can only do so little compared to the evolving threats, because threats keep evolving. For example, you can use VPN, of course, to protect all your communication and cipher them through. If you don't trust like the network with which you are communicating, you can use a VPN. But VPN can protect you only from certain types of threats, not all threats. And if you, for example, use a VPN, if a security service wants to target you, they can still target you even if you are using a VPN. And the fact that the debate that we keep seeing about putting backdoors in end-to-end encrypted communications and government pushing for that, like only shows how far that they are capable to go, like authoritarian governments are capable to go to ensure that they maintain their hold on all the communication. And I just want to pinpoint, like just yesterday, I think, or over this weekend, like there was an article by The Guardian about how Chinese government is using like the SS7 protocol to track their Chinese residents, even if they are in the USA. The SS7 is just a protocol that's used by all telecommunication providers. So they're just doing some requests over the phone lines to track all their residents, even if they are in the USA. And this is like a vulnerability that's already in the system, that's already in the networks. So countries can already do that. So what we are trying to do in our work is to advocate for these changes, for some major changes to make everyone like benefit from the security features that nowadays are only available to the ones who can pay for them.
Thanks so much for that. I want to hop on to the point you made about not everyone being able to afford an iPhone, which is generally considered to be the most secure device that you can use for personal communications. Because we've seen in the construction of digital communications infrastructure, we've seen Huawei increasingly being able to, or being contracted to build 4G and 5G infrastructure in the Middle East and North Africa. And in, I believe, Sudan and Algeria, they've been reported to have cooperated with state security to support surveillance of their citizens. Can you, and it is also just generally known that Huawei for this construction is much cheaper than more secure competitors like Ericsson and Nokia. And Huawei also, I believe, makes smartphones themselves that might be accessible to people in the region. Can you speak a bit to, at least in North Africa, what that sort of what that looks like and where you see that going in the future?
So speaking about the surveillance capabilities in North Africa, as you mentioned, not all North African countries have this, like, buy their tech from the same countries also. Like, and for example, what we have uncovered lately in Morocco, like Morocco, for example, used to work with the Italian hacking team before 2015 until hacking team no longer existed. And now they changed and they work with NSO, for example. The Algerian context is a bit different. Like Algeria cannot, like the Algerian authorities do not have like the liberty to in the public opinion to work with Israel as it is in Morocco, for example. In Tunisia, it's the same. So they get their technologies from different vendors. And actually what the trends that we are seeing today are more about like diversifying, like countries try to diversify where they get their tech from. For example, one of the things that we do is we examine export licenses from European countries and how they, like their defense ministries, to which companies they give the license to export surveillance technology to the North African countries. And we see, for example, that the biggest companies and the biggest countries that export these technologies to North Africa in general are like Germany, France, Italy, Emirates, Israel. So these are like the big players in the region. And China is starting to make like its entry, yeah, of course, but for now in the region we don't see that much. We see more like the usual suspects, as we say. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Pivoting to the other half of the question, which is or the sort of conglomeration of questions. I was wondering, Mohammed and Sahar, if you would like to talk for a bit about, just from a personal perspective, how someone can use platforms like Facebook and Twitter in a way where they can express themselves politically, but not need to worry about being surveilled and tracked for what they're saying.
Do you want me to comment on this, or okay? Generally speaking, I have a lot of media interviews, so my opinions are quite known, for good or for bad. But I do have some media visibility, so my interviews reveal my position and reveal my opinion, and I take responsibility for whatever I say, whatever I share on my social media platforms. But I really want to raise a number of flags here in light of this, discussion and this conversation. First of all, when we talk about things like, trying to use secure means of communication, I don't know if these exist anymore, honestly, with the way that governments are now able to penetrate a lot of platforms and go after the opponents in some unbelievable ways. Like we saw how, for example, some of the opponents of the Saudi regime have been, blogging and tweeting anonymously, and yet we saw the Twitter scandal, right? When you had some former employees who worked for Twitter, and they were paid by the Saudi regime to go after these opponents and find out who they are, and to actually reveal their own identities, which puts them in danger, right? So I mean, you have these kinds of examples where you really raise the bigger question. The bigger question is, how protected is anyone nowadays in this day and age, right? That's a very important question, with the regimes upping their games and learning all of these new techniques and tactics and building their own learning curve, as we said before. This is one important point. Another important point that Raed mentioned, which is really the economic aspect. As much as we hail this whole new social media revolution and the penetration of social media everywhere, the availability of devices, but we cannot turn a blind eye to many of their negative side effects as well, right? Some of them is the widening digital divide between the technological haves and have-nots. We cannot just assume that everybody in every corner of the world has access to 24/7 high-speed internet and has access to the latest iPhone 11. This is certainly not the case. So there is definitely the widening of the gap between technological haves and have-nots, which we call the digital divide. There's also the danger of slacktivism and clicktivism, which means people replacing clicking for doing or for taking action. There is the regime's digital authoritarianism and going after their own opponents and using new surveillance techniques. And there is definitely the loss of privacy, the invasion of privacy, and the threat to personal security, which are becoming realities, not just from regimes and governments. Even think about your consumer habits. When you use social media, you buy one item, and then companies come after you and say, oh, you will also be interested in XYZ. I'm like, this is so creepy. It means somebody has been monitoring all my social media behavior, for God's sake, and they suggest friends for you. Or you may also want to connect with XYZ. You want to buy this new coat. You want to watch this new movie. This is way really scary and creepy. It means somebody is putting their nose in your business 24/7, which is so scary. Think about the economic, social, and the political and security consequences for the average citizen, let alone those who are really at risk, as Raed mentioned, like the opponents of regimes and human rights activists and those who work for Amnesty and for other organizations. I think it would be wise to adopt what I always call the middle ground of cyber realism. We don't want to be in the cyber euphoria moment we're talking about earlier, techno euphoria, where social media is the end all, be all, the magic tool, the magic stick that's going to make everything happen. And we don't want to be cyber pessimistic either and to underestimate the importance of these tools. We want to be cyber realistic, which means really be in the middle ground of weighing the pros and cons, the positives and negatives, the advantages and disadvantages of these new tools.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, especially right now with so many people in quarantine, so many people relying now on social media to be able to connect with people because they can't connect physically. That we might see the pendulum of the sort of tech backlash, tech euphoria, kind of hopefully reaching that place of tech realism. We'll see. I'm personally not very optimistic, but we can dream. Mohammed, did you want to add anything to the question of using social media responsibly and being able to express one's beliefs safely?
I think honestly, the two speakers, Raed and Sahar, actually covered the question perfectly. Nothing further I can add on this point.
excuse me. I do have a separate question for you I wanted to ask, because speaking of the tech euphoria, tech backlash, after the rise of ISIS and the 2016 presidential election, Russia's interference, there was a lot of criticism of social media companies for not doing enough to crack down on ISIS, crack down on extremism, crack down on foreign trolls. But I think there's a particular challenge in doing this in the Middle East because there's the language barrier, there's the cultural barrier, and there's also the question of sort of what rules do you go by. So social media companies were inadvertently and then going back on deleting tweets and about criticizing the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which is specifically because Twitter is located in the United States. The United States now considers the IRGC to be a terrorist organization. And so someone expressing sympathy or seeming to express sympathy for the IRGC is considered to be equivalent to expressing sympathy with ISIS now. But it's not even as simple as that, because we still have groups that are that we've sort of considered to be as extremists, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, that aren't terrorist organizations, or groups like the Houthis that have engaged in attacks against civilians, but again, is not considered by the United States to be a terrorist organization. So can you speak a bit to the role that social media can or should play in dealing with extremism and terrorism in the region and navigating this space?
Of course. I think this is a very important question. Every second, there's 6,000 tweets on Twitter. There is no single big tech company that can do this in its own in-house capabilities, basically. Eventually, all these big tech are based in Palo Alto. They didn't really, as you mentioned, they didn't really have the language capabilities to track disinformation operations or fake news or content that inciting violence or sympathizing with organizations categorized as terrorist organizations. So it's really challenging. So the policy recommendation we always have for big tech is hire more content moderators, people who are native in local languages, Arabic, Farsi, Urdu. Prefer that they are basically based in the region, because as you mentioned, local context is so important. Someone who's speaking Arabic, let's say, or with a Saudi accent, but he's based in California, he doesn't really understand what's happening right now in Riyadh. He didn't really get back to Riyadh for the last 4 or 5 years. Maybe he's not really aware of the social events and changes, and that's important to understand. I know it's hard. I know it's also a big ask to do. I know that Facebook and Twitter have been hiring a lot of content moderators recently, specifically after the Russian interference in the US elections. They have been trying to step up their own capabilities in multiple languages, but it's hard when it comes to space, physical space. I think the solution that also can be unorthodox and can be helped a lot in that sense is definitely partnering with third-party fact checkers. We have a lot of NGOs in the Middle East who have been with low capabilities and low finances, have been very helpful in clarifying fake news. So you have Matsaddash in Egypt, or you have Kamana in Iran, you have Fatabayanu in Jordan. I think the 3 of them have been very effective. I know that Facebook started a partnership with Fatabayanu in Jordan. I think if this model could be replicated with all these fact checkers around the region, that would be helpful. That will help you identify this information, can act as safety valve during COVID-19 crisis and all these fake news around Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, WhatsApp that are going unnoticed because no one has the language capabilities to understand what they're talking about.
Thanks so much. Pivoting to Mark and Raed, we have a question. What do you see as the greater threat to digital activists in the Middle East and North Africa, either surveillance or trolling? What do you see as ways that that governments are trying to track digital activists' activity and either overwhelm or harass them? And do you think that one is superior, or one of them is going to win out as a strategy, or will both continue?
I think all the strategies complement each other. So I think one of the reasons you need to look at we're talking about surveillance and disinformation. We look at this within the broader framework of information controls, right? So the aim of surveillance partly is to, when surveillance is most effective, it's when it's continuous in its effects, but discontinuous in its actions. In other words, people fear surveillance and they fear the consequence of it, but surveillance doesn't actually have to be ongoing all the time. That's when it's reached its peak efficiency. So I think if you're talking about the online space, if people are afraid to communicate, afraid to express their opinion, then surveillance is successful. And how do you do that? You obviously show people that there are consequences to their action by arresting activists, exploring your capabilities, exposing your capabilities. I mean, this is the danger of what we're doing. I mean, we have to be able to talk about these issues, of course, because people need to be able to protect themselves. But at the same time, simply by having this conversation, we are actually saying to people, oh my God, the state as these capabilities will never truly safe, depending on your threat model. So that will discourage people from actually probably engaging in activism. But we still have to have this conversation. That's important. So what happens then if people are intimidated away from having or being critical? Well, then you leave a space vacuum, and that space vacuum is filled with your propaganda distributed by trolls, by bots, by government news agencies, right? So it's a complementary process. You remove the offensive information according to, say, governments or commercial entities, and then you replace that, you fill that vacuum with your propaganda and PR. And that's really how the kind of cycle, the ideal cycle of this information control loop will work. But I just want to, before I finish on that point, I think we also have to not let company, I mean, we've been very critical of the explicitly surveillance-oriented companies like NSO Group, because it's very obvious that what they do is incredibly ethically questionable. But we still have to be cynical of companies like Facebook and Twitter, especially Facebook, I suppose, because they have such a large market share. These companies are commercial companies. Their bottom line is profit. We talk about them needing to hire new staff, obviously what they do, because we have this reality where Twitter is used around the world. But at the same time, any other company that creates a product, rolls that product out in a way that then is weaponized by certain entities, should be held accountable. Companies should be doing due diligence. I blows my mind how these companies that are based in the US and therefore in theory subject to more stringent export controls are allowed to operate in countries that have a terrible human rights record when it comes to things like freedom of expression. There needs to be better mechanisms to control these companies. And we often talk about these companies in a framework of like, oh, these are tools of enabling free speech. The ontology's changed since 2011, right? I mean, I'm so cynical that, you know, I'm more suspicious of an account now than I am not suspicious. I think 10 years ago, I used to assume someone was real. Now I don't, which shows that my own paranoia is a problem here. But you have to bear in mind that this is the whole essence of surveillance. You break down trust between individuals, between activists, between opposition members. Once you break down that trust, those networks disappear. And then surveillance is having its maximum effect. And I think we're reaching that stage. And we shouldn't let social media companies off the hook for it.
Rod, do you have anything you would like to add to that?
Yes, I completely agree with Mark on the fact that both disinformation and surveillance or trolling and surveillance come hand in hand. I just want to cite an example of a country on which we are working here from Tunisia in North Africa, which is Morocco. In Morocco, we have seen like this coupling, like very effective coupling of surveillance and trolling at the same time. So the result of surveillance is immediately exploited by pro-regime newspapers or pro-regime websites that actually aggravate like an information. They get like a hint of an information by that was captured over surveillance, surveilling like a group of activists or people who are very who criticize like the government and the authorities, and then they actually make it out of proportion. For example, like if someone is talking about like receiving money, they multiply that sum by 100 or something like that, and they put it out in newspapers saying, yeah, you see this person who works for civil society, see like their association is getting money from outside of the country from like very suspicious sources and stuff like that. So they put a shade of and they break this trust that the public opinion has on that activist, because only like activists rely heavily on their word in the region. Like they are well respected people, and if you break this respect that the public opinion has for these individuals, like you break the cycle, like break everything. So yeah, they go hand in hand. So just surveillance is a means for authoritarian governments to impose like a certain status of fear, of distrust, and also a means of getting information that is used for defamation later. Also, yeah, that's the trend that we have been seeing through our research also.
I think that is all the time we have for now. So thank you all to our panelists, each of you. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join us, especially Raed and Mark, who are outside of working hours. Mark is joining us from Qatar and Raed from Tunis. So it is quite late there. And thank you as well to all of our attendees who joined. We really appreciate you guys joining this conversation. And yeah, hope you all have a great and healthy rest of your week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.